When I finally got the all clear to exercise after I had my first baby, I was so eager to join a fitness class with my friends. I was not going to let this fussy baby derail my plans to get my body moving again and to socialize with my friends. So I was going to be ready for anything. I loaded up a pack and play, toys, binkies, a bouncy seat. I had to make several trips back and forth from my car to the church gym where a friend was teaching the class. Mind you, this kid is only 2 months old, so he's not really playing with toys at this point, but I've just brought everything I can think of to keep him occupied so that I can have this time for myself. The next time I saw the friend who was leading that exercise class, she had a gift for me. The book Confessions of a Slacker Mom, about a mom who just decided she was going to do less, spend less, and accumulate less stuff than the average mom. It was a kind and not so subtle hint that I should just chill out a bit and maybe not bring my whole nursery to the next class. Welcome to the Family Lab podcast, where we embrace the fact that parenting and home management is one big experiment. That friend I was talking about is the wise and wonderful Tamsin Barlow, a friend who appeared just at the right time to guide me through early motherhood with very honest advice and feedback. Like the time she walked into my newly painted house and wailed, "You beiged it!" This is something Tamsin would never do to unsuspecting walls. Her walls were not boring, especially her most experimental walls in her mudroom right off the garage. She changed that room all the time, but the one that sticks in my mind was when it was a red color, and then she used, I don't know, maybe a muted pink, a lighter color, to finger paint flowers and leaves and curlicues that somehow looked amazing. Everything she touches looks amazing. Even her mailbox, actually, it was different every time I came, it seemed like, because she was always painting and repainting it in different whimsical ways. This episode is a tribute to Tamsin and the other motherhood mentors from my first 5 years of motherhood when I lived in Minnesota. That's one of the times that I think you need a mentor the most, is when you're just first starting out and you have so many questions. You really want to do this right, but you also need perspective because it's easy to get like a little over obsessive or worried or things like that. Anyway, motherhood is definitely a team sport. We need coaches, heroes, teammates, both in the game and on the bench ready to come in, all of it. This is all easy for me to say. My team has always been naturally big, partly because my family is ginormous and supportive. My mother is my biggest mothering mentor, followed closely by an amazing mother-in-law. I have grandmas, aunts, moms from my childhood, sisters, sisters-in-law, friends. I've really been blessed in this department. But also, I have met a lot of cool people through the podcast, all the amazing guests I've had, other podcasters. So my my bench runs deep. And I'm not saying this to brag. I'm saying this because I have mentors to spare and who I love to share with you if your team is not so big. So I'll play some clips from some of my mentors who've been on the podcast and link to their full episodes on the show notes and on familylabpodcast.com. And I'll also list several episodes about finding mom friends and supporting each other to help if you struggle to build an in-person mothering team. The reason we need a team of mentors is that we're all working on our own patchwork quilt of motherhood. So, for example, I snip off a wildly patterned section of Tamsin's artistic quilt to remind me to keep life colorful and creative, and I sew it to a snippet of the striped socks that my friend Shauna Brown wears to her annual witching night to remind me to host fun events and make room for everyone. I stitch that to a neutral homespun wool from my sister-in-law Ashley's quilt to remind me to be calm and introspective. And then I'll attach that to a piece of an exotic silk scarf from one of my friend Megan Robbins's many humanitarian trips. I'll add a piece of a spa bathrobe from my friend Molly Liggett, who reminds me to take time for myself, preferably in her company. I could go on, but I hope you're thinking of what makes up your own patchwork quilt. Another of my mentors, Maria Eckersley, speaks very eloquently about this idea of adopting characteristics from different amazing mothers.
I had these two phenomenal examples, very different examples. So my mom, she was a scriptorian. She raised 10 kids, so I'm number 8 of 10.
Wow.
So I grew up with my mom. She went back to school when I was young and got her master's and went back, ended up being a BYU professor. She loved teaching. So I saw her all growing up and wanted to be just like her. And then I met Jason's mom, and she was totally different, but also somebody I wanted to emulate. She was somebody who she didn't work outside the home. She didn't love the domestic-ish side of motherhood as much as she loved like the fun side. So she's the one where I learned how to do the fun mom stuff, like how to make a birthday
Okay.
amazing. So I kind of had these two very different, but phenomenal examples, and in my dream world, Whitney, I was gonna find a way to combine them. I was like, "I
Yeah.
there's gotta be some way that I can be both of those people," and so that was my dream. It didn't quite
Yeah.
work out for me in the short term, but in the long term, I have found that came to be. It's just I couldn't be all those things ever at once.
It's especially important to remember that we don't have to be as awesome as our motherhood mentors when we're first starting out. Sometimes they've been working on this for decades, so we can't do too much comparison. In fact, throw comparison out the window. Just appreciate what they're good at and try to learn from each other. It will take decades to piece all of these fragments together and weave them into the fabric of our own unique quilts. And then eventually we can snip sections off our own quilts and give them to other moms and become their mentors. It's just this beautiful cycle. So, in this episode, I'm going to talk about 5 of the things Tamsin taught me, and then I'll give one lesson each from several of my other mentors. I'm partly doing this to give you examples of what I'm hoping to collect for a future episode. I would love to collect stories about your own motherhood mentors and what they've taught you, and maybe how you've applied that, especially specific stories of advice, examples, or assistance that has stuck with you and changed the way you approach motherhood. You can send them to me in any form, video, voice memo, or text at whitney@howshemoms.com, or DM me on Instagram at Family Lab Podcast. If you want, we can even set up a time to meet in my online studio and we can just record it there. So, whatever works best for you. Okay, now back to Tamsin. Tamsin contributed so many of the foundational and very colorful squares to my quilt, including an abiding frustration at the very beige houses in my very suburban neighborhood. My own house is orange, the loudest hue my HOA will allow. The first thing I want to share about Tamsin is that she taught me to never stop learning in any stage of motherhood. She was just maybe 1 or 2 stages ahead of me. I was having my first baby. Her youngest was maybe kindergarten age, and she had some middle schoolers, if I'm remembering correctly. So, she had been through what I was going through and was a couple stages ahead. The first thing she taught me was to never stop learning in any stage of motherhood. She was my first podcast friend, actually, and we would share episodes and talk about big ideas way back in the early 2000s when the podcast world was just starting out. Like, people didn't even know how to listen to podcasts back then, but we were early adopters and we were all in. So we would compare notes, talk about our favorite podcasts, share episodes, all that good stuff. Um, she also introduced me to great courses, which were audio course lectures from incredible professors that back then we would borrow on CDs from the library. I still remember the first one she loaned me about the history of the English language. I loved every nerdy minute of it, and I would listen to it while I was doing dishes, stuff like that. It felt so good to keep my mind active while I was doing some very intense mothering in those early stages. The second thing she taught me was to let kids make mistakes, fail, and learn from it. This went along with another parenting book she bought me, which I've read and marked almost to oblivion, The Blessing of a Skinned Knee by Wendy Vogel. She led this by example, too. She would let her kids do all sorts of amazing things, go on adventures, and she just let them kind of learn by experience. And I loved that about her. Number 3 was to go all in. Her family was always diving deep into new obsessions. So for a while, it was medieval history. They hosted a medieval feast with costumes we could all borrow, turkey legs, dramatic hair, dancing, the works. It was no big surprise that one of her daughters actually became a bona fide medievalist, degree and all. When the Lord of the Rings movies came out, you better believe they were at the premieres in full costume. But then to take it further, they decked out their basement hallway with art from the movies and pictures of the actors. And then they watched every movie ever made by each of the actors in the movie. They just take everything a step beyond. Of course, they also eventually took a family trip to New Zealand and reenacted all the requisite scenes. In a totally different vein, they got really into the Tour de France one year, reading books about team cycling strategy and then watching all the stages. So I was definitely channeling Tamsin when my son turned 10 years old and he became obsessed with Hamilton and he wanted to put on a play. We ended up inviting 2 other families to fill in all the parts and we made a big deal of it. They memorized all of it and had costumes, all of the things. And since the karaoke version of the soundtrack hadn't come out yet, I actually learned to play the whole first act on the piano, which was no small feat. That's hard music, getting ready for this performance. So we prepared for this for probably a couple months, maybe a month, I don't know. But We invited an audience into our living room and performed the whole thing. I do not think I would have done that if I hadn't had the example of Tamsin just going all in and making a big deal out of what interests your kids. So that was a really fun thing. So thank you, Tamsin. Another thing she taught me was to develop my passions all along the way in motherhood and not to wait for later. Get your workout in, make your art, dance, sing, make great food, listen to music, go to concerts. She actually took me to my very first concert, and now that's one of my favorite ways to spend my time and money. She also used to burn me mixtape CDs organized by the mood of the songs, and it was so fun to see what would be on them. The titles were the best. The one I can remember is the CD called Mongolian Hordes Descending, and she definitely nailed that vibe. She always had a project going, and now, among other artistic pursuits, she's a landscape artist and a relief printer. Her art is seriously amazing. You can find it on Instagram at Tamzabar. It was this example of creating art and valuing creativity and endless curiosity that inspired one of her kids to become a writer, one a muralist, and one an illustrator. And the other one is a staff member on the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, which I guess is okay too, but I'm pretty certain she has some artistic side quests or will eventually as well. They're all really awesome. Number 5 is to open your house and gather people in. I already mentioned the medieval feast, but over the years of my husband's med school and residency, she opened her home to so many of us students, even though she knew we were only temporary residents. We had singing parties, dancing parties, ginormous and somewhat hazardous Easter egg hunts in the woods, innumerable birthday celebrations and feasts. I could go on and on about things Tamsin taught me, but I have some other mentors to talk about, including my own mother. So I'm going to limit myself to just one thing each for the rest of the mentors so that this podcast won't go on for days. And for the same reason, I'll have to leave many of my mentors out. So that's why I'm just focusing on that early motherhood. My whole podcast catalog is filled with other mentors, and they're great ideas for you to discover. So you will not run out. Okay, let's talk about my mom, Susan Singley. Picking one thing was hard, but I'm going to choose her skill of balancing self confidence and the ability to laugh at her shortcoming because those are things that I have needed so much during motherhood. There's nothing like motherhood for showing you where you're falling short. But my mom would just laugh at these things, then try to make them better. As far as I could see, at least, she did not let these shortcomings get to her. She would just laugh at them and often share stories of her failures and mistakes in a way that just charmed everybody around her and just didn't make a big deal of them. Seeing her do that all through my childhood was such a great example so that when I made mistakes as a mom, I knew that that was just part of the game. And I could move forward and laugh about it and even share it with other people. It's such a charming attribute and one she very deliberately taught us. I actually remember her sitting on the side of my bed when I was in middle school. I was probably 12 years old and I was just sobbing my eyes out that nobody liked me and I didn't fit in. She quoted a scripture to me from Matthew 22:39, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." And she told me that first I had to love myself before I could effectively love my neighbor. And then she told me what blew my mind, that when she walks into a room, she just assumes that everyone will like her, and they usually do. I was amazed that anyone could live like that. And it has taken me many years to get to that point in my confidence. As for her ability to laugh at her shortcomings and just the ridiculous situations we all find ourselves in, I have a whole episode about that called I'm Turning Into My Mother, or at least I hope so. Here's a clip. I wanted to start by asking her to tell one of my favorite stories.
Okay. We had our laundry room out in the garage. And I went out in the garage and saw that Whitney was standing out there with Cassie, and they were maybe 4 and 2. And I didn't see Cassie for a minute because Whitney was just standing right by the washer and dryer. And I said, "Where's Cassie?" And you pointed at the dryer, and she was inside the dryer, but the door was still open. And I just got panicked. I thought, what if I hadn't come out here and one of them had gotten trapped there? I always think of the worst things, and my mom always had somebody that something had happened to them, and
And they died.
they had died,
And that's what you
and
are.
that's what I did to you. I
Yes.
know, I do that to you. So anyway, I saw Cassie in the dryer and freaked out, and I said, "Oh my gosh, you 2, you could get hurt so bad. This is not any place that we play. We cannot climb inside dryers or washers." And I said, "Cassie, I want you to see how you can't get out if that door gets closed." I shut the door, and I'd forgotten that when you shut the door on the dryer, it begins rolling. And the only way to stop it is to open the door because you could not make it stop by using a dial on the top. But at the moment when I was hearing my daughter start to be tossed in there, I was punching every button on the top. And finally I remembered and opened the door, and Cassie looked out, and I wish I had a camera to get the look on her face, but mine was mortified, and yours was pretty mortified as well because I had just dried your sister.
And of course, we'll drop a link for that episode in my show notes. The next mentor I want to talk about is my mother-in-law, Margene Archibald. She has taught me many things, but one of the most important things has been how to teach kids emotional intelligence. When she sat down to play with my kids, she'd get really into character with the little action figures and help my kids make up elaborate storylines. She was so much fun. The kind of play where they could really work out some real world situations. And then she'd sit my kids on their lap and make up the most amazing stories with such sad endings that she'd sometimes get teary along with my kids as she finished them up. She'd cry at her own stories. It was so lovely. I asked her about her sad stories, and she told me that she loved to invent and read sad stories with her kids because it gave them a safe way to learn how to process emotions and practice empathy. Plus, it's so fun and filled with drama. I do have little clips of my mother-in-law in various episodes, but I've never done like a whole episode with her, so we probably need to do that sometime. So I don't have a link for you for that one. But the next one I do, my grandma, Donna Dayton, she taught me to delight in my children. She still lights up every time I walk into the room, and I remember this from my childhood. Sometimes she'd just be hanging out with us and get overcome and just say, "Oh, you're a wonderful thing and a ring-a-ding kid." That was one of her many sayings. So sometimes I just try to conjure my grandma and channel her delight with my own kids, and that's something that I could definitely improve upon lately. Even teenagers, maybe especially teenagers, need to feel just adored. My episode with my grandma is one of my favorite episodes of all time. I even had to bleep her once to keep it family friendly. So if you haven't listened to that one, it's about time. It's called How Donna Mommed Back in the Day. I'm actually going to backpedal on sharing just one thing because I want to show you this excerpt from her episode um, where we were talking about comparison and just the whole competitive parenting vibe that we have going on here these days. So I asked her if comparison was a problem back when she was raising her kids, and I loved her answer.
So these days, a lot of moms talk about mom guilt and feeling like they're not doing enough for their kids. When you were a mom, did you feel like there was comparison with other moms or that you didn't quite measure up?
I don't feel like we were all in the same. We were all poor. I think we all just did the best we could. Get them educated, go to church. And I was home tending them and there when they needed me.
Her reaction made me think. Maybe the whole concept of mom guilt, which is so pervasive these days, is as much a modern invention as disposable diapers and jogging strollers. The next mentor I want to share with you is Jana Free. She taught me always to participate and join in the fun with my kids. So as I mentioned, her last name is Free. So every summer, her family would host a free-for-all where they put out this giant slip and slide. They had a barbecue, potato sack races, the works. And throughout this event, she was always rounding up all the parents who had gathered under the trees to chat to get up and join in the games. She is full of fun and goes all in with any activity she does.
Don't stand on the sideline. If Scott and I go to a youth dance, we dance. And people may think we're crazy, but we have a great time. And we play with the kids. If we're at the park together, we're playing a game with the kids, right? We came up with this game called Dungeons and Dwarves. And, we play this game with the kids at the park. We're swinging on the swings. We're on the equipment. And, that's not to say that we might not sit down or whatever, but when we're places with the kids, we're participating.
That clip was part of an early episode called How She Connects with Her Kids. I'll include a link to that one, and I should probably dig up our whole interview and turn it into a standalone episode because she had so many great things to say. The last mentor I want to mention is my friend Lisa Holzer. She was definitely my housekeeping mentor. Her kids were just a few years older than mine, and yet her house always looked amazing. I remember once she came over and I was having her help me with my housekeeping woes. And you could have made a whole meal for what I swept up off my kitchen floor that day. So I asked her what she did when her kids made such a mess. And then I watched her struggle to formulate her answer in the very nicest way she could think of because her kids had never made such a mess. And that's when she taught me the magic of teaching kids not to make messes in the first place, something that should have occurred to me by then. For example, she took the time to sit with her kids while they ate so they didn't make the enormous mess in the first place, instead of letting them go to town on their own and then spending the same amount of time it would have taken to sit with them and help them eat to clean up the enormous mess that they made. It had honestly never occurred to me. Now, I'd love to say that it worked and now my house is always as spotless as hers and I've trained my kids brilliantly, but her help and training made me a much better housekeeper than I would have been otherwise. So even with all these people that I've shared, I'm just barely scratching the surface of the many incredible mom mentors from those early impressionable years. So I didn't mean to forget you if you were one of those. Um, I didn't even include any of my peers at the time who not only showed me how to mom, but actively participated in mothering my kids. I am so grateful for all of the mothers who have impacted my own mothering and taught me how to do this very hard thing that we're all doing. And I am so glad that I can share some of them with you and hopefully help you reflect on some of the motherhood mentors who are helping you design your own beautiful quilt. Maybe it will even inspire you to lend a square to a mother that could use your advice, guidance, and support, or even just companionship right now. This has really been my purpose with this podcast from the beginning, to provide a community of mentorship and support where we can laugh together at our mistakes, celebrate our successes, and find new ways to experiment. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Family Lab podcast. And thanks to my wonderful assistant, Kimberly Hansen, and my production assistant and editor, Miriam Brantley Merrill. And as always, thanks to my mom, Susan Singley, for playing the theme song for this podcast. She played this song all the time when I was growing up, and to me, it's the soundtrack of motherhood.